All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to manage grasshoppers this season. My name is Nicole Montreal, and I'm the Crops Extension Specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture in the Outlook office, and I'll be chairing today's event. CEUs will not be offered for this event, so there will be no QR code at the end. The Crops Extension Specialist team would also like you guys to know that Crop Diagnostic School's registration is up and will be taking place in Indian Head on July 25th and 26th. So we will put registration details in the follow-up email for you guys, and we will also have booths at Canada's Farm Show and Egg in Motion, so please come and chat with us. Today's presentation will be followed with a live Q&A with James Tansey. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and we will share relevant downloadable handouts with you in the chat box area. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you will be able to do so. Recording links will be sent out later today in a follow-up email. An evaluation will pop up at the end of the webinar this morning. Please ensure that you fill out the evaluation, as these really help us determine what topics you guys want to learn about and helps us prioritize some research needs for the future. We have a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind during the webinar. If anybody has any questions during the presentation, you may type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of your control panel. We will try to get to as many of our questions as possible, but we may need to limit due to time. Your question will remain anonymous and will be only sent to me. During the presentation, you will be muted so that we can ensure there is no feedback that will interfere with the audio. So we will get started now. Today we have James Tansey, Provincial Insect and Pest Management Specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture, who will give an update on grasshoppers and how to manage them this season. James has been the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture's Provincial Insect and Pest Management Specialist since 2018. Prior to this, he worked in row crop entomology research in Alberta and citrus systems in Florida. Pharmaceutical research in Idaho on house dust mites and regulatory affairs. He is interested in all aspects of insect-plant interactions. So just an FYI, James doesn't have a mic this morning, but he will be speaking loud and clear for everyone to hear him. And we will start whenever you're ready, James.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Excellent. So would you prefer I had my camera on or off?
You can keep it on, James. I think that's best.
Okay, super. Okay, I guess without further ado, we have a fair bit of material to cover, and we'll talk about grasshoppers. A little bit of background on them and some of the predictions from last year and how some of those seem to be coming true this year, as well as recommendations for control. So a fundamental question, what is a grasshopper? So they're members of the order Orthoptera. So it's a very old group. People talk about cockroaches surviving major catastrophic events. Arguably, grasshoppers are an older group and therefore have survived a little bit more. About 250 million-year-old group. They're characterized by generalist mouth parts, jumping legs, and incomplete metamorphosis. And what that means is they don't have larvae. They have nymphs. So from a fertilized egg, you'll get the production of a neonate or a first instar nymph, just a little guy. And that period between the egg and the first molt is called the first instar. The period between that first molt and the second molt is called the second instar, and so on. So with the pest species that we're dealing with, we have 5 nymphal instars, and finally the last molt results in the production of an adult, typically winged, and with our pest species, these are fully winged. With some species, you'll see relatively short wings, which can be mistaken for nymphs. With all of our pest species, these are fully winged and excellent flyers in many cases. So the group Orthoptera divided up into two suborders. So we got crickets, the Ensiphera, and we will get calls occasionally about these, especially about field crickets. So those are pictured top right. These are actually important consumers of grasshopper eggs and of grasshopper nymphs. They're generalists. They feed on plants. They feed on other insects. If it ain't tied down, they will try to eat it. That is a camel cricket pictured next, just below that. On the right is a katydid. These are quite common. And finally, a Mormon cricket. Mormon crickets can be damaging, but they're very rarely economic in the prairies. We will get occasional reports of them from the Southwest and from Southern Alberta, but only rarely economically important. They're pretty big, spectacular beasts, though. So if you do see one, you will remember it. 24 species of Ensiphera in the province. For the most part, not economically damaging, and can be actually quite helpful for regulating grasshopper populations in some cases. The next is the Calyphera, the grasshoppers and grasshopper-like, and really this is where we're getting into the pest species. These are primarily herbivores, relatively low diversity as far as insects go, with 11,000 species worldwide. I mean, when you're talking about beetles, about 125, 130,000 species described. Similar numbers for Hymenoptera or the wasps. Similar numbers for flies. You know, so you got your hyper-diverse groups. These are relatively lower diversity, but there are still a fair number of species. We've got about 85 species in Western Canada. Only about 4 of these are typically problematic. So that isn't to say that the other non-pest species can't be damaging in high numbers. They're all herbivores, but for the most part, the non-pest species are going to be specializing on plants that are not in cropping systems. So they don't represent a risk to crops as a rule, but there are a lot of generalists in this group, and you can get the occurrence of some of our non-pest species in large numbers in crops, and they can be damaging. However, typically we're talking about 4 species in the province. So here, just pictured a few of our non-pest species. Sorry, the top right are 2 of our pests. So we've got 2-striped grasshopper, so called because of the 2 stripes you can see extending from between the eyes to the tip of the wings, and Packards right next to it, where the 2 stripes just extend onto the pronotum from behind the head. So don't extend onto the wings. These are closely related animals. Girls from this species tend to be relatively large, you know, the size of size of my pinky. So non-pest grasshoppers, good mantra. You know, if it has wings in the spring, it's not a pest. That comes with a big asterisk this year, because we are actually seeing really rapid development of grasshopper populations with the high heat that we've had. They are ectotherms. They really like it hot. So really, the warmer the better for the pest species. And we've got occurrence of 5th instar nymphs in South Central region right now of 2-striped grasshopper, which means that we are very likely to see the occurrence of adults well before late June. So we are getting into mid-June now. So you know, we're going to see occurrence of wing adults in some areas. So wings before late June, asterisks, you know, assuming that the weather is behaving itself. With the very warm conditions that we've had this early season, they're really speeding along. However, brightly colored hindwings is a real good giveaway that you're not dealing with pests. We've got a Carolina grasshopper pictured top right. These are big, meaty animals, noisy flyers. These are adults in the fall or in the late summer. Not typically pests. They are herbivores, they are large animals, but they're typically feeding on grasses and ditches and you know, native grass species. Generally not a threat in crops. The next one is the speckled wing rangeland grasshopper, and I'm seeing lots of these ones in central and southern regions. So noisy flyers, these things are about 1 inch long, you know, conspicuous oxblood red hind wings. And very active, but yeah, again, very noisy flyers. So you know, if the animals have got brightly colored hind wings, or they're noisy flyers, or they're callers or chirpers. So we do get calls occasionally about different species of crickets, particularly in forages, and For the most part, these are not damaging. They can occur at relatively high numbers, but for the most part, they're not damaging. So if they're calling to each other, you're not dealing with a pest species. So when we're talking about the pests, these fall under three broad groups. And the first we'll talk about are the spur-throated grasshoppers, so-called. You can see the photo here with the red bar pointing at the spur on the throat of the animal. It's not really, the structure isn't called a throat, but you can see that conspicuous spur for the sake of identification. These tend to have short antennae, and that's a real good giveaway if you're dealing with a pest species versus a non-pest. Short antennae, typically a pest species. Long antennae, you're dealing with crickets and katydids. That's going to be a non-pest species, although they are still herbivores or generalists. So top of the head's going to be rounded, face vertical or only slightly slanted, and again, that characteristic spur. So some of the short antennae and spur-throated grasshoppers include animals in the genus Melanoplis. And we got three of our real big pests here. So we got lesser migratory pictured on the top. And I'll give some of the characteristics for these so you can do field identification, including of nymphs. The next one is Packards, and as mentioned before, you can see that the yellow stripes just occur on the pronotum, just behind the head, and two-striped grasshopper. And the two stripes on that one are very characteristic, and you can see the black stripe on the hind leg, also very characteristic, and you'll see that in the nymphs as well in the upcoming pictures. So lesser migratory grasshopper, sometimes confused with Bruner's grasshopper, which typically occurs in higher latitudes and higher altitudes. But in the Peace Country in Alberta, it can be a significant pest, and in northern regions of Saskatchewan, northern growing regions in Saskatchewan, can be mistaken for lesser migratory. It is a close relative of it. And even when we're talking about lesser migratory, we are talking primarily about Sanguinipes, but there are two other species that can be mistaken for this one as well. They all have similar characteristics, similar behaviors. So functionally, you can consider these to be part of the lesser migratory complex. They are a medium-sized animal, 23 to 28 millimeters as adults, and black, dark grayish brown tinged with red. You can see the red hind tibia are really characteristic of the last segment on the legs, and the tarsi, or the feet, typically colored red. And you can see that the two stripes on the hind femur are very characteristic. The wings are going to have a spotted pattern, and once again, that red tibia. You can also see bluish tinges or yellowish tinges, but typically red in this part of their range. So they are omnivores. They will, much like our field crickets, they will eat much of what they can tackle. They do prefer forbs, grasses, wheat, barley, and other crops, but push comes to shove, they will feed on other insects, live and dead. They will feed on dried manure. They will feed on whatever organic material they can find. They can outbreak, and they can travel in very large numbers, great distances. You see their range extends right from northern Mexico right up into the Yukon and into Alaska, Northwest Territories. So they are broadly distributed across North America. Their migratory behavior, where they're moving in real big numbers as swarms or engaging in locust-like behavior, typically restricted to the southern part of their range, although this can occur in our part of the world as well. And we did actually have an occurrence in the last year or so of what was likely them being detected on weather radar, flying at about 10,000 feet. So they can fly at great heights. They've been detected at those heights in very large numbers, and fouling airplane propellers and that sort of thing. So potential problems for airplanes, and of course they can move very large distances when they're engaged in that swarming behavior. So in 1938, there was one swarm that was documented moving 1,000 kilometers from South Dakota to Saskatchewan, and once again, commercial pilots reporting strikes. The migratory behavior isn't restricted to the adults. Nymphs, especially late instars, so pre-flight, they haven't developed their wings yet, they can be moving at 10 miles a day. So they can really get around a lot. So this has implications for field by field control. Of course, you can put down, you know, an insecticide in the field and get good efficacy, control that population. And once the effective residue time for that chemistry has elapsed, then you can get movement of these animals back into the field from surrounding areas, because they do tend to move around. So I mentioned before some characteristic markings on those. No need to go over those again. And here are the nymphs, also relatively characteristic. You can see that black stripe extending through the eye. You will see that on all the nymphs, as you can see here. So 5 nymphal instars. A photo of the eggs at the bottom. They do overwinter as eggs. All of our pest species overwinter as eggs. So typically groups of 18 to 24 eggs laid in soil late summer, relatively shallow, so about 2 centimeters. And it's thought that snow cover can have a profound effect on protecting these animals from harsh winter conditions. Although they are pretty tough, they can take conditions minus 15-ish, minus 18-ish, and still survive. And this is associated with their super cooling temperature. So a lot of insects survive the winter by the production of proteins and or alcohols. And what this does is lowers the freezing point of their blood. So without crystal formation, they don't get tissue damage. It's not the cold that kills, it's the crystal formation and the resultant tissue damage. So they can survive that. However, if we get a prolonged cold snap without snow cover, that can result in some pretty significant overwinter mortality of these species. Get snow cover, they're pretty well insulated. They're going to be right around the freezing point underneath the snowpack. So that could be profoundly influential on them. And of course, we had a pretty good snowpack in large parts of the province this winter. Good, relatively fecund, 250 per female eggs, that is. Typically going to hatch May, and these ones are a little bit ahead of schedule with the hatch, and we'll talk a little bit more about one of the other species that's really well ahead of schedule. Yeah, these ones are moving along, and I am seeing the hatch proceeding in central and south central regions for lesser migratory. I haven't seen them in the southeast and haven't heard reports of them in the southwest, but I'll have a better idea soon. So young grasshoppers, once again, 5 nymphal instars in 35 to 55 days. That all depends on temperature. And of course, it's very warm right now. They're going to be ripping through their development very quickly. So it's going to be the short end of that. Once again, Packard's grasshopper, you see those 2 stripes on the pronotum up top, typically blue tibia. And these girls are big. So this is one of our biggest pest grasshoppers, arguably larger than 2-stripe, its closest relative as far as pest grasshoppers go. And once again, you know, about the size of my pinky. So these animals can consume a lot of material as adults. There is a bit of a misconception going around about the consumption of plant material by adults versus nymphs, and it's probably best to stem that in the bud right now, or nip that in the bud right now. Adults do feed, and they feed a lot. So I think this may have been, I don't want to say misconstrued, but confused maybe about, you know, inflicting control on populations when they are nymphs, so as to, you know, you get a better selection of insecticides that will be efficacious for them, and you can inflict better control for them. However, if adults are present and they're feeding, you're going to want to consider controlling them because they are damaging. These ones prefer open habitat, light textured soils as a rule. Blue tibia again, and greatest pressure in the northern range, and these ones really like legumes. They tend to prefer lusher plants, and will feed on small grain cereals, but they do prefer legumes and can be a real problem in some legume crops. So looking at the nymphs here, you see there's an overarching theme of green, with the exception of the neonates. But yeah, green nymphs, short antennae. You could be looking at Packards. We haven't seen big numbers of Packards in the past couple of years, with the possible exception of some pockets near Saskatoon, but it's always one to keep an eye out for. Once again, these overwinter as eggs. These are going to hatch May, June, 5 nymphal instars. I haven't heard much about large numbers of these animals coming up, and I haven't seen large numbers of these animals coming up, but it's one to watch for. Two-stripe grasshopper. This is the prevalent pest species in Saskatchewan, and you can see the black stripe on the hind femur and the two stripes extending from between the eyes to the tip of the wings. Females can be large, and once again, up to 40 millimeters, 1.6 inches, or slightly larger in some cases. It depends on their nutritional input as young. Pardon me. So they do prefer lush habitat, so heavier textured soils, forbs, but they are generalists. And push comes to shove, they will feed on other different plant species. There is a peculiarity amongst some generalist grasshoppers for obligatory host switching. So you will see grasshoppers in a field happily munching away, and then they can just move. And reason being is, in the case of some, especially the pest grasshoppers, generalist grasshoppers, they have a little switch in their brain where they'll munch on one species of plant, and then they're obliged to switch to another species of plant. They don't get everything they need from any one species of plant, and so it behooves them to switch hosts. So they can move in sometimes large numbers from host to host. So it's something to watch for as well. Of course, these animals are large and powerful flyers, and they can engage in that migratory behavior, much like lesser migratory grasshopper, and move great distances. These can be pests of alfalfa and other crops. When you see these ones in large numbers in a mixed alfalfa brome hay, oftentimes you'll see the brome is completely untouched and the alfalfa is completely wiped out. So they are exhibiting host preferences in those situations. They will, however, feed on cereals if that's what they have. So once again, overwinter is eggs. Eggs start to hatch about 8 to 10 days ahead of migratory grasshopper, and it was well ahead this year. So these animals were actually hatching about 8 to 10 days ahead of schedule. So about second week of May, third week of May, we were getting reports of large numbers of nymphs coming up, and oftentimes damaging numbers of nymphs, so that required spray. So third instar nymphs, second instar nymphs, causing enough damage to warrant spray. Once again, the migratory behavior of both nymphs and adults. These tend to invade from field edges. They're going to overwinter. They're going to be laying eggs in ditches and roadsides and moving into crops from those. But once again, they can move great distances, which makes control in individual fields occasionally very complicated. You can see that black stripe is characteristic on all of the nymphal stages and all of the adults. Looking at the hind tibia, we are seeing fourths in the Regina area and Lumsden area, and in some other areas as well. So they are really speeding through their development quickly. So banded wing grasshoppers, this is the second group that we'll talk about. There's only one species that's a major pest, and this one can be a serious pest of cereals. This is the clearwing grasshopper, primarily a grass feeder, and they can be a devastating pest in cereal crops. So yellow to brown mottled forewings and transparent hindwings. You're going to see those light stripes that converge, and what's really characteristic about these ones is that camouflage pattern on the forewings. Pardon me. Very characteristic of these animals. They're not as big as two-striped or backards, so they're going to be in the inch range. Medium-sized grasshopper. Of course, it's a numbers game. They occur in very large numbers and can be very damaging. Another characteristic feature is that carinae, or the keels on the pronotum, and you can see that little ridge. You may not be able to see that without a field glass, but it's very distinctive of this animal. And you can see as well, this is a native. It does occur throughout North America, including large portions of Saskatchewan. So once again, overwinter is eggs. The nymphs are relatively characteristic, especially the neonates. You can see that black and white pattern, very characteristic of their first instar. So if you start to see these coming up, these ones tend to come up early. So I'm thinking if there are areas with relatively light sandy soil, south aspect, these are well on their way to developing. I haven't heard specific reports about clear-wing grasshopper. However, we have had localized populations of very large numbers. What we'll see, and we'll talk about a little bit, is soil moisture and its impact on grasshopper development. And these ones are very sensitive to it. So they need a little bit of moisture, and this is timed with conditions that will produce a bit of green feed for those nymphs to consume. So you're going to see, with rapidly rising temperatures and following a shower, those conditions are going to be associated with the potential for food sources coming up, and that's going to stimulate nymph hatch. So of course we had some very, very timely rains in large parts of the province, and we've had very warm temperatures. So every reason to expect problems with this animal this year, although I haven't heard specific reports to date. We can also see problems with slant-faced grasshoppers, and this is a relatively large group. Erytetics here is just offered as a sample. You can see why they're called slant-faced grasshoppers. These are only occasionally pests, but they can occur in numbers that are large enough to be damaging. Usually found near wet areas, and of course we do have a lot of wet areas this year in different parts of the province, particularly in the northeast and southeast. So under dry conditions, these don't fare as well. Some members of this group are also common in dry grassy fields and pastures. It is a relatively large group. They feed primarily on rangeland grasses and sedges, but they can be a problem in crops too. So grasshopper development, I indicated that we would talk about some of the factors that are going to influence population numbers and population success. And probably one of the most important is temperature. They are ectotherms. All insects are ectotherms, and all aspects of their development and their physiology and their behavior are influenced by temperature. So what's occurring inside that egg, of course, is the development of an embryo. High late summer and fall temperatures are going to speed development of that embryo. And of course, we had warm conditions late summer and fall last year. And then they're going to enter into what's called a state of diapause. And it's a little bit like hibernation, but it's associated strictly with arrested development. So that embryo is going to stop developing, and it won't continue developing until the conditions are favorable for that. And that includes warm spring conditions that's going to cause what's called a break in diapause and allow them to complete development and hatch. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail and some of the interactions of different factors. So moisture, very important. Eggs must absorb water. They are not standalone units in the soil. They're still interacting with their environment. It's a minimum soil moisture of 13.5% is necessary for egg development, and embryonic development can only proceed until completion of early development at 13.5, but will cease if dry conditions occur. So this allows them to remain in a state of arrested development until conditions improve. So, and they can stay in this condition for additional years. So delayed development or delayed diapause is relatively common in insects where the environment is a little bit uncertain. And of course, on the prairies, there are no guarantees. And of course, all of these animals are native and have evolved in these conditions of consistent uncertainty. So that development is going to halt until moisture increases. Dry conditions after this stage are going to slow development again, but they're not going to stop it. What you will see is egg death if moisture drops below 1/3. So temperature can kill, those very low temperatures without the protective effect of snow cover, and very dry conditions, so exceedingly dry conditions can kill grasshoppers as well. Dry conditions, as a rule, are going to benefit their populations, and I'll show you what that means. But there is a distinction between dry and very dry. So really, what we're talking about is a period. So all of the temperature effects over the winter are going to influence that stage of development. And just for completion of thought, just a cartoon and some photographs of grasshoppers developing inside their eggs. So moisture and temperature interact, of course, and both of these are extremely important. It's the initial thinking in the 70s and up until relatively recently was that we had a linear effect. And of course, you can see this linear relationship well documented. It's thought now that it's not a linear relationship. There is a plateau and a fall off, of course, with temperature, as is the case with most insects. So it is possible to be too warm for these animals to develop, and there's lots of evidence of that. You can see, these starts and stops of development, and the second part of this figure is showing that. And these are associated with, the loss and accumulation of moisture. So you can get that halt of development with insufficient moisture, and then completion of development, and then that secondary slowing of development with loss of moisture. So so moisture and temperature, these are going to interact with other organisms that feed on grasshoppers as well as grasshoppers. And a really important component of this are fungal pathogens. And I'll just talk about a couple of them, a couple of the most important ones. One is Bovaria bassiana. And this one's actually being explored as a biological control of grasshoppers and ligas and a number of different pests. Some of the isolates are very specific, and they can be very potent pathogens of these animals and really knock down populations relatively quickly. However, grasshoppers have a way around this, and it's called some have described it as a behavioral fever. So they will actually engage in basking once infected to raise their internal temperatures and right up into the 40s. And this is going to reduce the success of the fungal pathogen. It's a reason that we express fevers when we're infected with a pathogen as well. It's to slow the progress of that pathogen. Grasshoppers just happen to do it behaviorally, where we do it physiologically. So grasshoppers really like it warm as a rule, and they will raise their internal temperatures to fight off sickness. However, Bovaria can be a significant mortality factor. Another significant mortality factor is Entomoptera grillii. So this fungal pathogen is associated with humid conditions and cool conditions. You will see local outbreaks of this in conditions that are conducive with the production of thunderstorms. And of course, we've seen a fair bit of that this year already. I haven't heard any reports of large populations of grasshoppers being infected with Entomoptera, but last year we had large acreages of grasshoppers climbing to the tops of plants infected with the Entomoptera. It obliges them to climb to the top of a plant, grab on for dear life, and die. And once it begins to disintegrate, it's going to rain fungal spores down onto its brothers and sisters and pals, and subsequently infect the rest of the population. They'll climb up, and you can see how this would increase exponentially in the infectivity. So there have been outbreaks that have been stemmed by outbreaks or epizootics of Entomoptera. So an epizootic is like an epidemic, but associated with a non-human species. So late 30s, late 40s, early 60s, major outbreaks terminated by cool, wet weather and subsequent outbreaks of Entomoptera. So really what's going to stem our current trend of large grasshopper populations is cool, wet weather. We of course are left to try to control these animals, but functionally it's the weather that's gonna limit their impact in broad areas. They also have a host of natural enemies, and we'll talk about a few of these, starting with blister beetles. These are Epicotta blister beetles. These are relatively large animals, about an inch long, gray. There are other members of the Epicotta that you can see that are about half that size and kind of coppery color. You're going to see these munching on flowers in fields. Not typically economically damaging, although they can do a lot of damage to small plot research and be a real headache for researchers. In a commercial field setting, they're very rarely economically damaging. They will munch on flowers, however. What's really going after the grasshoppers, however, is not the adults. It's going to be that little beast listed as A. That's the triungulin larva, and it is highly mobile and a voracious little predator of grasshopper eggs. So this female blister beetle is going to lay her eggs near where the grasshoppers have laid their eggs, and this triungulin larvae are going to hatch, and they're going to go seeking grasshopper eggs, and they're relative specialists on grasshopper eggs. We do have another species of Relatively conspicuous blister beetle, that's the big black kind of purpley sheen ones. Those are called Nuttall's blister beetle, and those are actually predators as triangulate larvae of solitary bees. So they're really not going to have much of an impact on your grasshopper population, but they can be relatively numerous in some fields. The next photo we'll talk about, you can see this cricket is having a very bad day. It has had what's called a nematomorph, or a horsehair worm. There's no nice way to say it. The horsehair worm has exploded up the cricket's butt. So the cricket has imbibed water that has the nematomorph eggs in it. The horsehair worm has developed inside the hemocoel, or the blood cavity of the cricket, and you can see this is a very large worm. This is the equivalent of a 30-foot worm bursting forth from a human. So oftentimes when we're talking about parasites and parasitoids, the Alien movies arise, and I think that would have been a very different franchise with this consideration. The next one we'll talk about is Myrmis, and this is a nematode, not to be confused with a nematomorph, which is the horsehair worm. Different groups, although they look superficially very similar. You can see this one has exploded out of this grasshopper as well. They become infected with these feeding on plants, and you can see there's an adult nematode here working over a plant. They're going to lay their eggs on the plant's surface. Herbivorous insects come, munch on those plants, consume the eggs, and the nematode develops, or nematodes develop inside the hemocoel of that unfortunate grasshopper. So yeah, it can be hard to be a bug. Some other ones include tanglebane fly. These have a really interesting life cycle. They produce a lot of eggs. So these females are going to produce about 2,500 eggs each, and they're laying them in trees and fence posts, and which seems like a really odd place to lay an egg if your host is a grasshopper. These eggs are wind distributed, so big winds come up, as they do in Saskatchewan, and they blow the eggs around. So it's casting a broad net. If these eggs happen to find their way onto a grasshopper, and if grasshopper populations are large, there's a good chance they will. The larvae will develop and consume that grasshopper as a parasitoid. There are also sceliospecies egg parasitoids. It's a small parasitic wasp that seeks out grasshopper eggs and lays its eggs into those and consumes the developing larva. An important pest of grasshopper nymphs are Formica sanguinea, which is a formicine ant that's relatively common in Saskatchewan. You'll see these things, large nests, oftentimes in pastures. These nests can be 5 feet across. Conspicuous black and red form or coloration, and they're aggressive. They're biters. So if you're standing in one of their nests, you'll be aware of it. Happily, we don't have any stinging wasps in Saskatchewan, but these guys compensate for that with a really bad attitude. They are also slave makers, so they're going to raid in large groups. They'll send out raiding parties to raid the colonies of Fusca and Neo-Kagadi species groups, so other native ant species, and they're actually going to harvest, in this case, an adult. They will also harvest developing pupae and occasionally eggs of their victims, haul these back to their colonies, and they have a caste system. The new slaves become the lowest caste, so all the dirty work gets done by the slaves. So for those of you who weren't aware, yeah, we have slave-making ants in the province. We base a lot of our predictions about this coming year about grasshopper populations on conditions associated with last year, and I'm sure you can connect the dots with what we're talking about for this year and predictions for next. So this is based on modeling done by Owen Olford et al. In 2020 and published in 2020. So warm spring, important for an early hatch. Of course, we had a cool wet spring last year in large portions of the province. That delayed the hatch, but it didn't put it to a halt. And of course, we had very warm conditions, so they could make up for that late hatch with rapid development to adulthood. So we get rapid onset of production of adults. That means there's a lot of eggs going in the ground. And the longer that we have adults active, the more eggs are going to go into the ground. And these can stay active. And when we're talking about two-striped grasshopper, they will stay active right into October. They're going to look very tatty when October comes. They've had a lot of close calls, but those that have survived are still getting the last dregs of their eggs into the ground. So warm conditions conducive to rapid development and production of eggs, rapid development of nymphs, and success of those nymphs and production of adults. Ovipositions can be related to adult densities, and so of course boy needs to meet girl. Beautiful music plays, eggs go into the ground, and the timing of that, and the timing of the emergence and production of adults, very important for that. And of course, we had very dense populations of grasshoppers in the province. This is based on the 2022 survey, so this is our forecast for 2023. And this is overlaid or standing next to the conditions in July and in August, not pictured, but similar in August. Got a little drier in August last year, but large numbers of grasshoppers in central regions and southern regions, and dry conditions, severe drought in some cases, but not so dry as to kill grasshoppers. So we've got a bit of a perfect storm for production of grasshoppers this year, in addition to warm spring conditions and timely rains for the production of green feed for the nymphs. And with that, we'll move on to the next topic, and that is control. So evaluation of populations and economic thresholds. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back here. So like, really, everything for next year depends on the conditions in July. There are some factors that could contribute to broad mortality if we get the onset of very cool, wet conditions. It doesn't seem very likely right now. It seems we're going to have continued warm, dry conditions and good conditions for oviposition. So if we maintain high populations and these conditions, we could be looking at more trouble for next year, barring a very cool, wet spring and early summer next year. So economic thresholds, and this is applicable for this year. The pest population with which pest control measures must be taken to prevent the pest population from rising to the economic injury level. So sometimes economic injury level and economic threshold or action threshold are mistaken. And the economic injury level is that balance between the cost of control and what the grasshoppers are costing you. You want to avoid that. So you want to inflict control on them before that happens, and that's what the economic thresholds are associated with. So we've got good nominal economic thresholds. So it's evidence-based, hypothesis-based, but not experimentally derived economic thresholds for a lot of different pest species, and we've got some experimentally derived economic thresholds for others. Typically, an economic threshold is going to be about 80% of the economic injury level, and that is a bit of a rule of thumb, but that's typically where it lies. So this action threshold, we're trying to avoid that economic injury level, where the cost of control is not paying for itself. This is going to vary by crop location and grasshopper development, and it varies by pest. But you can see the functional relationship here. The population continues to grow, the dotted line, to the economic injury level, unless you inflict control. Then you can knock it down. There's a possibility for it to continue increase and require subsequent application or subsequent control. But you've negated or limited the impact of that population to below the economic injury level. So for small nymphs, the economic threshold in crop is 30 to 45 per meter square, and we have certainly seen populations in that range. In the ditch, 50 to 75. Given the conditions this year, I would err on the low side. That is warm, a lot of activity, and with commodity prices being what they are. So yeah, I would err on the side of 30 in crop, 50 in ditch. For adults, this is going to vary by crop. So generally 10 to 12 per meter square. You do see recommendations of 8 to 10. So look at 10 per square meter as a good general guideline. There's going to be less tolerance if growing conditions are challenging. So the grasshopper's impact is going to have, or the pest's impact is going to have more of a damaging effect on that plant. And that needs to be gauged case by case. But generally 10 per square meter under most growing conditions for most crops. For canola and soybean, they're more tolerant to foliar damage. So 14 per square meter is our guideline for that. If they're munching on pods, though, that's obviously the cash component of those crops. So you're going to want to weigh those case by case. Typically, canola is not a preferred host plant of these animals, though again, push comes to shove, everything's on the menu for some of these species. In the ditch for adults, 21 to 40 per square meter. Oh, sorry, I skipped over one. We've got a couple of crops that are particularly sensitive. So flax in bowl. Grasshoppers can go right underneath that bowl and clip it. So that's knocking off the money part of the plant. So obviously low tolerance for grasshoppers in that crop, and lentils in flower. So 2 per square meter in both of those crops. Flowers are particularly sensitive, as are early development pods. And some of these species, particularly Packards, really likes to munch on early pods. So keep an eye out for those at low numbers. So how to evaluate these populations? There are 2 primary ways. So I'll illustrate these for you. One is the method we use for the provincial survey, and that is to walk a transect. So at least 50 meters, and you're going to want to look at different parts. Like any evaluation, you're going to want to look at different parts of the field, determine if they are invading from the edge, if they've made it to the middle of the crop, and this, which part of the crop. And this will influence the area that you need to control or want to consider control, and your timing for control as well. So 50 by 1 meter. Really, what you want to do is this applies to both fields and ditches, and depends on of course the stage of the crop. I mean, if you're in a chest-high canola crop, this may not be the most effective strategy for you. So hold the meter stick to be able to estimate the insects in 1 meter field of view. Test that, put the meter square on the ground. You can try holding it up and see where that applies to your field of view. You're going to want to walk 10 meters of that transect, record the grasshoppers if populations are high. You'll want a clicker counter. Pardon me. Repeat this at least 5 times. Divide the total count by 50 if you've done 5. If you've done 60, divide 60 meters, divide by, or 6 counts, 60 meters, divide by 60. But typically repeat this 5 times, divide by 50, and this will give you your per meter population over this 50 meter area. So again, you're going to want to monitor multiple locations. Don't make a decision just based on one small set of data. Also take at least 5 sweeps to determine your species, and that'll give you a good indication as to what you're dealing with, because you can have large numbers of grasshoppers in a crop not causing damage. A good example of this is clearwing, where you can see this in broadleaf crops, and they don't really have much interest in it, and they can just be basking to increase their internal temperatures. So look for damage, look for corresponding damage associated with these animals. So if you're seeing animals and not seeing damage, you may not need to put down control. But obviously, if they are causing damage, then yeah, release the hounds if they are a threshold. There's another technique as well, and it's to take 4 180-degree sweeps in a row, and this works well for high crops, and you can modify this for low crops. So 4 180-degree sweeps, so one shoulder to another. If you're in a high crop, if you're in a low crop, do a pendulous sweep, where you're going to hit about this much of the ground on it. Try not to take up soil, so 4 kind of loping sweeps as you walk forward. Don't repeat sweep an area because you've already disturbed those insects. No double sampling with sweeping. So take the sum, and that'll be your your grasshoppers per square meter. So I mentioned before, in ditches and low plants, that pendulum swing It can take a bit of practice. So a lot of people when they first start trying this are going to end up with a sweep net full of dirt and a bit of frustration in their hearts. Yeah, practice makes perfect. So yeah, try it out a few times, make sure your technique is good, and then it is a real time saver for evaluation of populations. You can hit multiple populations more quickly than doing the walking survey. Oh, pardon me. Jumping back and forth between slides, I apologize. So check the guide to crop protection. There are a lot of products registered in a lot of different crops for grasshopper control. Of course, I'll talk about some of the limitations that we've had put on us recently, but do not go off-label. I've heard about some reports of some off-label applications, and really you can get yourself into some trouble with that. If you're looking at the guide to crop protection, our Pest Management Regulatory Agency of Health Canada demands efficacy data for registration of a product. So if it has grasshopper on the label, you can pretty much take that to the bank that it's going to be efficacious if you follow the label directions. And I'll talk about some of the label directions for specific products. So if it's registered, there's a good reason for it. If it's not, there's also a good reason for it. So consider MRLs as well if you're considering, and please don't go off label. You don't want to get into MRL trouble. So that is maximum residue limit trouble, and timing of application can have an impact on that. So follow the guides on the label. The label is the law. The label is the law, etc. So some considerations, as I mentioned before, several products, and I'm sure everyone is aware, several products registered for grasshopper control have been taken away from us. And of course, several products can significantly impact natural enemies, and these can be natural enemies of grasshoppers or of other pests. So consider that into your calculus when you're making your decisions for applications. We're seeing populations of other insects come up as well, so you may not just experience grasshoppers this year. And of course, natural enemies can have a strong regulating factor or can be strong regulating factors on pest populations. So the first ones we'll talk about is synthetic pyrethroids. And of course, there has been a lot of news about lambda cyhalothrin, so these are that's the active ingredient associated with Matador and Volume Express, Silencer, La Bamba, Zavada. Do not use lambda products if your crop is intended for animal feed. There may be some restrictions from your buyer as well, so check with them if they will accept those crops. I realize that for feed, this is going to complicate things a lot, especially with the import of feed from the United States. There are a lot of moving parts with this, but yeah, my advice is be careful with lambda cyhalothrin or Matador Silencer. So in the case of group 3 insecticides, and I'm just going to back up a little bit, these can be extremely effective for young grasshoppers. And this has, there is one exception in the case of permethrin products. And as I recall, that is Ship and Upside. These are not registered for grasshopper control. And I hope someone corrects me if I'm remembering those two products wrong. But in the case of permethrin, these simply do not work very well on grasshoppers, even young ones. So, or at least two-striped grasshopper, that's our primary pest. So you may want to steer clear of that one. There's a reason it's not registered for grasshoppers. Be aware of temperature recommendations with group 3 insecticides, especially deltamethrin products like Desis. 25C is a pretty good cutoff for that one. You're going to see a lot of volatilization with that one, and it can be subject to UV breakdown as well. So temperature is going to reduce the efficacy of some group 3s, especially deltamethrin. And efficacy is going to be less for mature nymphs and adults. So if you're looking at mature nymphs, so that is 5th instars with wing buds, and adults, you're going to want to look at other products because you're not going to get the efficacy that you're hoping for with group 3s. So some examples, and this is for wheat, Desis 100 EC, and several other deltamethrin products. Upside Ship. Oh yeah, I apologize. Upside Ship is actually cypermethrin. So I'm not remembering the permethrin products. Check the guide to crop protection though. So permethrin products, don't use those on grasshoppers. Silencer, Labamba zivata. These are Lambda cyhalothrin, and of course, if you're producing crops for feed, steer clear. Group 28 insecticides, or the diamides, are effective against adults and mature nymphs. What freaks people out a little bit about the group 28s is they're not knockdown insecticides like some of the other ones, but you're going to see this rapid cessation of feeding. So the animal's still going to be alive, but it's not feeding, or it's feeding much less, and then it's fine, and then it will die. But these products are very effective. So the Coragen and Coragen Max. Group 1B insecticides are some of our older chemistries. Some of these go back to the 1930s. These are the organophosphates, and they are effective against adult grasshoppers, but they're also broadly effective against a lot of other organisms, including a lot of your natural enemies. So consider this with control, but you're going to get some good control of grasshoppers with these products. Adult nymph rates are going to differ. See the guide. Non-selective contact, ingestion, and vapor action. So the vapor action is associated primarily with chlorpyrifos. Now that is, or Lorsban and products that have the same active ingredient. And we've got until December of this year to use stores. You can't buy it anymore, but if you do have stores of chlorpyrifos products, you've got until December of this year to use it. There's also malathion products. And in the case of this one, the efficacy actually improves with temperature. So above 20 degrees Celsius, you're going to get an increase in grasshopper physiology, and that helps to increase the toxicity of that product or of that active ingredient. There's also dimethoate, and this can be a highly efficacious product for grasshoppers. And in the case of dimethoate, you're looking at about 8 days of efficacy for these ones. So you got good residual, you've got systemic activity for this one as well. So the group 1Bs can be excellent products for grasshopper control. Baits can also be very effective. And Nolobait, I have no personal experience with Nolobait, but from what I've seen and from what I've read, it is an efficacious treatment for it. There were considerations associated with production of this material with their, I believe, California production facility having some issues, but there has been a statement that stocks will be available June of this year, so the end of this month. This is a biological. It is nosema or paranosema, so all the nosema are now part of the paranosema, as is pretty typical of biology. So paranosema locuste, it is a biological. This is actually a mobile fungus. Used to be considered a protist. The protists are now part of the fungi, as is biology, right? So, so anyway, long and the short of it, you can get good control of this year's population, and you can get horizontal transmission and vertical transmission. So horizontal transmission is, me to that guy, and vertical transmission would be mother to progeny. And so you can get transmission of the pathogen there, so you can actually get long-term control of the population. And I've read as much as 10 years of suppression of populations. So it can be an excellent solution for grasshopper control. So applications to fields when no above ground harvestable food commodities are present, generally pre-bloom. You can see the recommendations associated with this product associated with the label. So if you are interested in getting supplies of this, so am I. I'm very interested in testing it, and I'm curious to test it on my own place. EcoBrand is another product. This is a group 1A or carbaryl. Another very old chemistry, not specific, but it needs to be ingested. So PMRA has actually limited the uses of this one. So some recent restrictions, so corn, alfalfa, clover, wheat, oats, barley, rye, sweet white lupins have been removed from the label. So there are still applications where you can use this. So it is a carbaryl impregnated bran flake. This is one I do actually have some experience with, and it works very well. It will kill a large number of grasshoppers in relatively short order. So, however, do consider other things that may be consuming those bran flakes. Cultural control can also be helpful with grasshoppers. You're not going to get knocked down with cultural control, though, and you're not going to get total mitigation of grasshopper damage. Pardon me, but it can reduce the impact of grasshoppers. Early seedling of crops, so you're going to have more resilient plants that could take a little bit more damage, especially for those that like canola and soybean that can take a fair bit of foliar damage. Crop rotation can be important. So two-stripe grasshopper doesn't prefer oats or peas, so these can be good choices for rotational crops to limit grasshopper impact, limit their reproductive success, and limit the numbers of eggs that are going into the ground for next year. Tillage has been demonstrated to be effective, although recent studies haven't been done. This is relying on a lot of the work that was done in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and slightly more recently. But the thinking on this one is, rather than the tillage contributing to mortality of the eggs in the soil, you're taking away that early green feed for the nymphs. So you're basically starving them out with tillage. Of course, full tillage is not the current trend, with where we're looking at low till or zero till currently. Trap strips have been demonstrated to be effective. So that is alternating cultivated green strips of about 10 meters and around a field. The more times you can do that, functionally you're trying to concentrate those grasshoppers on the green strips, and providing a zone of starvation for the nymphs that they won't cross. So if you can concentrate those nymphs, you can limit those populations with an insecticide application or another technique if you prefer, and limit the area that needs to be applied. So green strips can be seeded to wheat, so it can be to an alternate crop or to another preferred crop of the species that you have in your area. And with that, I will ask people to please sign up to allow us to access your fields. For the grasshopper survey, of course, we use SCIC does the sampling for the Ministry of Agriculture, and my hat's off to them for excellent work. But they will be sampling roadsides and ditches, but we need access for other surveys. So please point your phone at this QR code. A little menu will pop down and fill in the fields, and you'll be entered into a lottery to win a survey of your field. Great. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, James. That was a great presentation. We do have a few questions, so I think that we will kind of hop right into the Q&A here. So first question is, how long can the embryo stay in diapause?
Yeah, so it varies by species, but delayed diapause has been examined in some species, and they can stay for at least a year. Of course, you're going to get a fall off of survivorship. The longer they're in that delayed diapause, they can stay for multiple years, but you're going to get a fall off in survivorship. So can be multiple years, but at least a year.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, since the blister beetles feed on the plant, would products like Coragen kill them as well?
What's interesting about Coragen is it's considered to be a very selective insecticide. And the reason being is that some beetle groups and some ants, bees, and wasp groups have differences in what's called a ryanodine receptor. So grasshoppers and Lepidoptera, or caterpillars, moth larvae, have one form of this receptor. Some beetles and ants, bees, and wasps have a different form. Or different forms. So this means that the lock of that chemistry, or the key of the chemistry, doesn't fit into the lock of the receptor. And if it doesn't fit in there, then you're not going to get the toxicity. So it actually needs to bind to that receptor on the neuron to have efficacy. And in the case of, I can't speak to blister beetles specifically, but some beetle groups have been demonstrated to have differences in that ryanodine receptor. I suspect blister beetle is probably the case. So it's a good choice for preservation of natural enemies. Coragen, that is.
Okay, very interesting. Our next question is, are these thresholds counted by sweep nets or shake trays usually?
See, I haven't used shake trays. So the two methods that I presented were, of course, the walking survey and the sweeping survey. Yeah, I can't comment on the shake trays. I just haven't seen data on it.
Nope, that's all good. So migratory grasshoppers, can the underside of their femur be bright red as well?
Yes. There's, and I did mention that it's got a couple of doppelgangers as well. So there's a couple other Melanopus that are really closely related. We can get Brunner's grasshopper, which look a lot like them and do have red tibia. But yeah, you're going to get some variation. You're going to color morphs within the same species. Variations on that red theme. We also have another pest species called a red-legged grasshopper, where the bulk of that hind leg can be a bright red.
Okay, tricky.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, no, grasshopper morphology in the field when they're flopping around is tricky.
Okay, our next question here is, are the thresholds different if the wheat crop is headed out?
No. Yeah, and that's I hate to say it depends. It depends where that feeding is localized. We do have some accounts of two-stripe grasshopper being a bit of a notorious head clipper. So that is something to consider. If your population is dominated by two-stripe and you're seeing head clipping, then your tolerance, of course, is going to go down. If they're munching on foliage, and the crop is headed, the photosynthetic input from that foliage is, has been exploited.
Okay.
So consider what the insects are actually doing. But yeah, if they're cutting heads, then for sure your tolerance of those animals is going to go down.
Okay, good to know. So for lentils, what is the threshold when they're not potting? When should control be taken?
Typically, and again, this is a bit of a case by case, because I prior to this year, I was 10 per square meter in lentils when they're not flowering early pot, full stop. However, I've gotten reports of young grasshoppers doing significant damage to lentil fields, to seedling lentils. So yeah, again, it's a bit of a case by case, but this was very large numbers of nymphs. So and this is an anecdotal account. I don't have a count of the actual per square meter counts on the nymphs that were in this field, but there is a potential for them to do significant damage to tissues other than flowers and foliage, but typically the foliage isn't all that palatable to grasshoppers unless it's Packards, and of course we haven't seen large numbers of Packards this year or last year. But yeah, treat it as a bit of a case by case, but I think you can look at that 10 per square meter as a general guideline, unless you're in flower. Well, not you're in flower, but unless the crops are in flower or early potting.
Right, and when we're in flower and potting, it's 2 per square meter, right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Did the grasshopper survey underestimate the problem we now face? And if so, why?
Interesting question. Difficult question. I think some of it is an artifact of resolution, right? So I mean, I'm not going to fault SCIC for their efforts. They monitor almost 1,500 sites over the province, but we still, Saskatchewan is a huge area. 1,500 sites, although that sounds like a lot, is just a small snapshot of the total numbers of fields in the province. So it's absolutely possible that very large populations could have been missed. And I have heard reports about that, especially in the Swift area. If you look at the forecast, it's predicting relatively low pressures in those areas, despite the fact that we have regionally high pressures. They get washed out a little bit in the representation on the map because it is a smoothing function that gets put on this map. So it's a localized high density population can get lost in the wash if it's surrounded by relatively lower populations. So there can be problems with the representation of it, but obviously you can see representation of 1,500 sites on a map could be problematic, just from an interpretation point of view. But yeah, I think those are the major considerations, and I think the representation from the map may have represented less the threat than actually exists in some regions. because of this washing out of real dense populations.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I know that kind of that's for all of our maps too that you see. You can get a bit of that smoothing out of the lines, and so I would say kind of what James just explained can go for all of our maps that we put out. Yeah, we do our best to get as much information as we can. So our next question is there any video demonstration of the pendulum sweep net technique?
Oh yeah, come to the crop diagnostic school. I'll give you a face-to-face demonstration. But no, that's an excellent idea. It's something we could probably put on Twitter pretty quickly. Currently no, but great idea. Yeah, so it's something that we should throw on there.
Perfect. Yeah, we will get that going. So besides oats and peas, are other crops like chickpeas and mustard less preferred?
Yeah, it's thought, we're just talking about mustard, it's thought, you know, the glucosinolates in mustard and canola have, you know, will dissuade the feeding of generalists like grasshoppers as a rule. You know, of course, the glucosinol profiles in different mustards and canola are going to differ and have different effects on specific grasshoppers, but as a rule, it's thought that these defense compounds are actually defending against grasshoppers. Of course, it's a numbers game. You get lots of grasshoppers, and you can accumulate damage to those crops as well. For chickpeas, oh yeah, I'm straining my memory here, but I do recall. Yeah, I'm not remembering 100%, so I don't want to say absolutely chickpeas this way or that, but
No, that's all good. And if whoever asked that question wants to just reach out to one of us specialists, we can dig for that answer for you. So will hoppers die earlier this year with the early hatching, or will they live as long as environmental conditions allow?
they will live as long as environmental conditions and natural enemies allow. Yeah, as I mentioned before, two-stripe will keep going right until that first hard freeze. So I mean, both last year and the previous year, I was seeing, you know, sometimes really beat up two-stripe grasshoppers surviving right into mid-October.
Good to know. Can Volium Express still be used for grasshopper control as it has both Lambda and Coragen?
Yeah, the issue is Volium Express is not being marketed this year. So Syngenta has recalled their products. So both Matador and Volium Express have been recalled. I think, I don't entirely support the decision from the PMRA to limit the use on feed. Reason being is the EPA with very similar data arrived at a different decision, and I think for the sake of trade harmonization, I think makes a lot of sense to have those products available. And I'll just leave it at that without getting too far into the weeds on regulatory parts of things. But I'm sorry, the other products we were talking about were Silencer and Zivada. Yeah, I think look at the labels for those, and look at the guide crop protection for the crops that are permitted for those, and just steer clear of animal feed.
Okay, I'll get you to just lean in a bit for the next question. Do you kind of like your audio kind of came in and out a little bit there, but I think the main message for Volium Express is that it's not being marketed for use this year.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so Volium Express and Matador are not available this year.
Okay. Okay, our next question is, would more growers allowing access to fields result in better forecast maps?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, more data is always gooder data. However, yeah, we do have manpower constraints, and I think, you know, we already have 1,500 sites. I think that's about as good as we can get with a survey. Yeah, I you know, definitely appreciate the offer, but if you're interested in participating in other surveys, you know, we'd certainly be happy to bring into the fold.
Awesome. What effect will moisture through July have on adults?
It depends. It depends on the level of moisture and the level of humidity. Of course, humidity could contribute to the outbreak of fungal infections. Yeah, it's going to be primarily a disease issue, and it's a bit of an unknown. Yeah, I think that's about my understanding of that. Yeah, the limit will be associated with pathogens.
Okay, nope, that's good. What other insects should be on our radar based on the season so far? Wheat midge, Bertha, diamondback moth, etc.
Yeah, so we are seeing some diamondback moth catch, not alarming to date, but they are increasing. So they, relatively timely arrival for those ones. So that's one we're going to continue to monitor for. Bertha, we've only just begun, but we are seeing Bertha populations in a number of different regions, and of course this one is due for an increase. We've been at very low levels for Bertha armyworm populations for the last couple of years, and this is a cyclical pest, so it's regulated very strongly by natural enemies, primarily viruses, and it's due to escape the regulating effects of those natural enemies and increase again. So we are actually slightly overdue for an outbreak of Bertha. We will continue to watch for those ones. One that I'm a little bit concerned about is wheat midge, because we had relatively high populations last year in a number of different areas, and we had very timely rains. So more than 25 millimeters before the end of May, or at least 25 millimeters before the end of May, stimulate these animals to complete their development. So this is another one that actually goes into a delayed diapause state if it doesn't get the right conditions. So it's going to be, inches under the ground as a pupa, and when it's stimulated by, or pardon me, as a larva, and when it's stimulated by those rains, it's going to move upwards towards the surface and pupate and complete development, and be ready to emerge right around Canada Day. To begin laying eggs in wheat crops. So that's what I'm concerned about. Cabbage seed pod weevil, we still don't know. We saw a relatively steep reduction in their geographic range last year, and relatively low numbers. But this year we'll see what their populations are actually doing. We saw an increase in pea leaf weevil in the Northeast last year. And just in the last few days, I've seen a few fields in the Southeast with some decent populations as well. So that's another one to watch for.
Great, thanks, James. I think maybe our last question here. You said that two stripes grasshoppers can go until October. What about migratory and clearwing?
Clearwing, I haven't seen working that late, or I haven't seen active that late, or lesser migratory. I think it might be twofold. I don't see why they wouldn't live as long, but a lot of bad things happen to grasshoppers. I mean, they are important sources of food for a lot of different critters. Relatively smaller populations of clearwing and lesser migratory this past year than two stripe. I think it might just be a numbers game. So just, it's a little bit like sunfires and K carves. The only reason you're still seeing them is they made so many of them.
Awesome, thanks, James. We actually had one more question come in. NOLABate website is saying it's not available for 2023. Is the June date you mentioned current, and maybe a behind the scenes update?
No, this is something I saw on the company website. I wonder if this is only intended for the US though. I'll look into it a little bit more though. This is one I'm really curious about. So.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, James. That is it. So yeah, at this time, we would really like to thank you, James, again for doing this in season. And we would like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for the event. Please take the time to fill out the survey that will pop up so we can know if you guys like these in-season surveys, and if you do, we'll keep doing them. If anybody has any questions regarding these topics or anything else related to farming, please contact your local Saskag regional office or the Ag Knowledge Center at 1-866 457-2377, and we will be sure to put you in contact with a specialist to help answer your questions. Thanks again for joining us for today's session, and don't forget to check out any of our other events coming up, and check out our social media pages. So that's all, and thank you guys.
Thanks, Nicole.